I've always been comfortable staying home alone. My apartment is on the top floor of an older, well-maintained building, and nothing unusual ever happens around here, until that one strange night last spring. It was a Saturday evening, and my plans fell through last minute, so I decided to have a quiet night in. I made dinner, threw on a movie, and settled on the couch. The windows were open to let in the cool, spring air, and I could hear the occasional car passing by on the street below. Around 9 p.m., as the movie was nearing its climax, I heard what I thought was a knock on my door. It was faint, barely noticeable over the sound of the TV. I hit pause and listened closely. Silence. Figuring it was just my mind playing tricks, I shrugged it off and went back to the movie. But 10 minutes later, the knock came again, this time louder, more deliberate. My pulse quickened as I stood up and walked cautiously to the door. I peered through the peephole, but the hallway outside was empty. A chill ran down my spine. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor passing by had accidentally bumped into the door. I locked the deadbolt just to be safe and returned to the couch. Then I heard it again. Not a knock this time, but a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging something sharp along the doorframe. My breath caught in my throat. I muted the TV and listened as the scraping continued, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building's security desk. "Hey, this is apartment 3F, I said, keeping my voice steady. "Is there anyone hanging around the hallways tonight?" The security guard's voice crackled over the line. "No one's reported anything." "Want me to come up and check?" "Yeah, please," I said. While I waited, the scraping stopped. Silence stretched through the apartment, heavy and oppressive. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank or some weird maintenance issue, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. After what felt like forever, there was a knock at the door. "Security," a voice called. I rushed to open it, relief washing over me as the guard stepped inside. I checked the hall. "Nothing there," he said. "Maybe it was a pipe making noise or something." I nodded, though I didn't believe it. He lingered for a minute before heading back downstairs, and I locked the door behind him. Everything was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to call it a night and headed to my bedroom. That's when I heard it, the sound of my living room window sliding open. I froze in place. I hadn't closed the windows earlier, but they were on the 3rd floor. No one should have been able to reach them, but now I was sure someone was inside. I backed into my bedroom, heart racing, and locked the door. Dialing 911, I whispered my situation to the operator, trying to stay calm. They assured me help was on the way. Minutes passed in tense silence until I heard faint footsteps moving through the apartment, coming closer to my bedroom door. The handle jiggled and I felt my chest tighten. "I called the cops," I shouted, trying to sound brave. "They're almost here." There was a pause, then soft laughter, low and unsettling. The footsteps retreated, and I heard the window slide shut again. When the police arrived, they searched the apartment and surrounding area but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the ground below the windows. They told me it was likely a prank or maybe my imagination, but I knew better. Someone or something had been there that night. And what haunts me most is that I never found out how they got in or where they went. This is a story I've hesitated to share for a long time because it still gives me chills when I think about it. It happened 3 years ago when my partner and I moved into a small, rural town. We wanted to escape the hustle of city life and find a quiet place to raise our daughter. The house we found was perfect, or so we thought. It was an old colonial-style home with charm and character. The best part, it came at a price we couldn't resist. The previous owners had moved out abruptly, which should have been a red flag, but we were too thrilled about the space to care. The first few weeks were uneventful. We spent our days unpacking and exploring the property, which included a small patch of woods in the backyard. Our daughter, Lily, loved it and spent hours playing near the tree line. One evening, while putting Lily to bed, she told me something odd. She said she didn't like the man in the woods. My heart skipped a beat. I asked her what she meant, and she said he was tall and quiet with a big hat, and that he watched her while she played. She said it so matter-of-factly that I didn't know how to respond. I told myself she was just imagining things. Kids do that, right? Still, I kept an eye on her whenever she played outside. A week later, I started noticing things out of place. The back gate, which I always kept closed, would be wide open in the morning. Tools from the shed would be scattered in the yard. I even found muddy footprints leading up to the back porch one morning. I told my partner, but they brushed it off. saying it was probably animals or some kids from the area messing around. I wanted to believe that, but deep down I wasn't so sure. One night, as I was locking up before bed, I heard a faint sound coming from the backyard. It was a low, rhythmic tapping. I looked out the window, but the yard was pitch black, save for the faint moonlight. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The sound stopped as soon as I opened the door. My heart was pounding as I shone the light around. Nothing. I felt silly for being so jumpy and went back inside. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tied to the handle of the back gate was a small bundle of sticks, twisted together with string. It looked like some kind of crude charm or marker. My partner dismissed it as a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant as a warning. That night, I heard the tapping again, louder this time. I stayed inside and peeked through the curtains, my breath caught in my throat. Standing at the edge of the woods was a figure. He was tall, just like Lily had said, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned hat. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the house. I woke my partner, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone. We called the police the next day. They did a sweep of the property, but found nothing. They said it was probably a drifter or a neighbor playing a prank. But the way they said it felt dismissive, like they didn't believe us. They suggested installing motion lights or cameras. We didn't have the budget for cameras, so we settled for the lights. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. Then, one evening, while doing dishes, I glanced out the kitchen window and saw something that made my stomach drop. The motion light at the edge of the woods flickered on. I froze, staring into the darkness. And then, slowly, the figure stepped into the light. This time, he wasn't alone. Two more figures emerged from the shadows, all dressed in the same dark, old-fashioned clothing. They stood there unmoving, watching the house. I screamed for my partner, who grabbed a baseball bat and stormed outside, yelling threats. The figures didn't move. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they turned and disappeared into the woods. The police came again and did another sweep. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. That was the last straw. We borrowed money from family and installed cameras. For weeks, we anxiously watched the footage, but nothing unusual happened. We started to relax, thinking maybe the cameras had scared them off. But then, one morning, we found a chilling message scratched into the wood of the back door. "We see you." We packed our things and left that same day. We sold the house at a loss and moved back to the city. To this day, we have no idea who those figures were or what they wanted. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think about that message and wonder, are they still watching? It was mid-January, bitterly cold, and I was working the graveyard shift at a highway rest stop convenience store. The place was out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods. On a clear day, the scenery was picturesque. On a cold, dark night like that one, it was downright unsettling. The snowstorm had started just after 10 p.m., and by midnight, the parking lot was a sheet of ice. I hadn't seen a customer in over an hour, so I busied myself stocking shelves and cleaning up. The only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the occasional creak of the old building settling in the cold. Around 12:30 a.m., I heard it. The crunch of footsteps on the icy lot. I froze, listening, as the sound grew closer. A man appeared out of the storm, his figure barely visible through the frost-covered windows. He was tall and wearing an old ragged coat, the kind you'd expect to see in a thrift shop. The automatic door slid open and he stepped inside, snow trailing in after him. He didn't say a word, just stood there for a moment, shivering. "Cold out there, huh?" I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond. His face was pale and his eyes were wide, like he'd just seen something terrible. I asked if he needed help, but he just shook his head and walked to the far corner of the store, where the coffee machine was. I watched him carefully as he poured himself a cup of coffee. His hands were trembling so much that half the coffee spilled onto the counter. He didn't seem to care. He just stood there, staring into the cup like he was trying to warm himself with the sight of it. A few minutes passed and I was about to go back to restocking when the door slid open again. I looked up expecting another customer, but no one was there. The man turned his head sharply toward the door, his eyes darting back and forth. "You locked the back door, right?" he asked suddenly, his voice low and hoarse. What I replied, confused. "The back door," he repeated. "You locked it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "There's no back door, just the emergency exit," I said. The man's face turned ashen. "Then it's too late," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, the lights flickered. The building groaned as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The man backed into the corner, clutching the coffee cup like it was a lifeline. "What's too late?" I demanded, my voice rising. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the back of the store, where the emergency exit was. My stomach tightened as I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the door. "Don't open it," he said urgently. "Whatever you do, don't open it." I stared at him, unsure if this was some kind of prank or if he was genuinely terrified. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it turned into pounding. My instincts told me to grab the phone and call the police, but before I could, the pounding stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard the soft creak of the emergency exit door opening. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a metal broom handle, and slowly made my way toward the back. The man stayed where he was, muttering something under his breath. When I reached the emergency exit, the door was ajar, letting in a freezing gust of wind. Snow swirled into the room, but there were no footprints outside, just an empty stretch of snow-covered ground. I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. As I turned back toward the front of the store, I realized the man was gone. His coffee cup sat abandoned on the counter, still steaming. I never saw him again, and I don't know what happened that night. The security footage from that shift was corrupted. Static filled the screen for most of the night with only brief, blurry glimpses of me and the man. But every now and then, when I work a late shift, I hear it again, the tapping at the back door. A year ago, I moved into a modest, two-bedroom house in a quiet rural area. The rent was cheap, the neighbors were far enough away to offer privacy, and the surrounding woods were peaceful. For someone like me, introverted and tired of city life, it seemed perfect. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my evenings unpacking, reading, or going for walks on the trails nearby. The house had its quirks: creaky floorboards, doors that didn't quite shut properly, and an old basement I avoided simply because it gave me the creeps. It wasn't dirty or anything, just wrong. The basement door was in the kitchen, and it had a small, rusty lock that didn't actually work. Whenever I passed by it, I felt uneasy, like someone was standing just on the other side. I chalked it up to paranoia and ignored it. One night, about a month after I moved in, I was in bed reading when I heard something strange, a faint but distinct noise, like a scraping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe an animal against the house or a branch brushing the siding. But when I turned off my lamp and listened, I realized it was coming from inside. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I froze, straining to hear. The scraping stopped for a moment, then started again, slow, deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. My heart pounded as I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe something had fallen over, I thought, or maybe it really was an animal that had somehow gotten inside. Grabbing a flashlight, I worked up the courage to check it out. The basement door creaked loudly as I opened it, and I felt a rush of cold, stale air hit me. My flashlight beam trembled as I descended the old wooden stairs. The basement was mostly empty, save for a few shelves covered in dust and a single chair sitting in the middle of the room. There was nothing else there. No sign of movement, no tracks, nothing that could explain the noise. Feeling more unnerved than reassured, I went back upstairs and shut the door. That night, I barely slept. The next few days were quiet, and I started to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But a week later, it happened again. Only this time, it was worse. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, when I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the basement, slow, deliberate, one step at a time. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink. The footsteps stopped just beneath the basement door. Then there was a knock. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks on the inside of the door. My blood ran cold. I wanted to run, to call someone, to do anything, but I couldn't move. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone down there? Had they been hiding there the whole time? How had they gotten in? Finally, I mustered the courage to speak. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed a kitchen knife and backed away, keeping my eyes on the door. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the knife. After a few minutes of silence, I forced myself to open the door. The stairs leading down to the basement were empty. But there, on the top step, was something that hadn't been there before, a small wooden figurine. It was crudely carved, resembling a person with long, thin limbs and no face. I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though I knew the lock was useless. The next day I called the landlord. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. But I asked if there was any history to the house, or if anyone else had ever mentioned strange noises. He paused before answering. The house used to belong to a man named Walter, he said. He lived alone for years, but he wasn't all there, if you know what I mean. Kept to himself, carved those little figurines in his spare time. When he passed, no one claimed the house, so it sat empty for a long time. What happened to him, I asked. The landlord hesitated again. He died in the basement. Heart attack, I think. That was all I needed to hear. I moved out the following week. I don't know who or what left that figurine on the stairs, but I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps or the knock at the door. And sometimes when I lie awake at night in my new apartment, I wonder, if I'd gone down there that night, would I have found Walter or something else entirely?